Hi, and welcome to an episode of the Play Therapy Circle. I'm Kylie Ellison, a therapist, clinical supervisor, and play therapy trainer, and I'm so grateful you're here. This podcast is a space for thoughtful, soulful conversations about child-centered therapy, play-based work, and what it means to show up with presence and compassion, both for our clients and for ourselves. Whether you're a seasoned play therapist, a student just starting out, or someone deeply passionate about working with children, you belong here. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Play Therapy Circle podcast. I'm your host, Kylie Ellison, and I am so glad you are here. This topic that I'm going to talk about today is really about starting to highlight and validate for anyone working in the child-centered play therapy space who is seeing an increase in children with anxiety and separation anxiety in the 4 to 6 year old age group. So I need to put another caveat to say that this episode in no way is intended to have any conversation other than talking about the research and talking about the mental health of children. So I know that there is many opinions on this topic, but I'm going to talk about the impact of the pandemic of COVID-19 on what we are seeing in current practice. So in the episode, I've put in the title 2025 because I think that this is very emerging research. There is a good body of research already out there talking about this topic, but I just couldn't give an exhaustive overview in this episode. I would be talking for days, you guys, to cover all of the research material and outcomes. So this is very much intended to begin that conversation for those of you working in the play therapy space right now, in the child-centered play therapy space, who are seeing an increase in that population of children, 4 to 6 year olds, with anxiety and separation anxiety. So how I want to tackle this is to talk about the data, because that's really important. I want to talk a little bit very briefly, guys, because there's just so much out there. I want to acknowledge, I guess, some of the more global literature, recognizing that we have a global play therapy circle community. I want to talk a little bit about how the neurobiology of what kids experienced during that time that has had an impact on what we are seeing now in current day in 2025. How child-centered play therapy can help, because that's absolutely essential and important, as always, to bring it back to CCPT and what we love so much. And I want to start the conversation about some of those strategies we can offer to parents. I really am keen for feedback, guys, after this podcast. If there is further topics you would like me to talk about, there is a whole population of kids who are now teenagers, who were preteens during COVID. That is another body of research all on its own to look at. So that might be another topic I do down the line. But I want to talk about that 4 to 6 year old age group specifically. I'm going to make sure in the notes of this podcast that I will list the references that I'm going to talk about today, so you guys can check them out for yourselves, and to make sure that I am following my practice guidelines as a registered counsellor as well. So this is a very interesting topic for me. It's been something that I have been presenting on at conferences for the last couple of years. I've had the opportunity to present at a few, including the Early Childhood Australia conference last year. I think that was. Yeah, that might have been last year. Because I have started to dive into and read about, and I'm certainly not an expert, and this is certainly not exhaustive, guys. There is so much out there. But just in the beginnings of reading through some of those research articles and the data and the statistics that are coming out of it, I think are important to share, so that for you as child-centered play therapists, you can begin that conversation with your clients and your families in that space, and for them to be able to access this research and to talk further about it. So you best believe I have lots of notes to read off. So for those of you watching on YouTube, this is probably going to be a really boring episode in terms of watching me talk, because I'm going to be like referring to notes the whole time. I think that it's really important because I want to get this information right. I want to get that information out there in a way that's accurate in terms of reflecting what I have found so far. And I definitely encourage you guys to do your own research in this space. This is purely an introduction and really, as I said at the beginning, an intention around validation for our practitioners, but also our families. So please feel free to share this episode with parents as well, or caregivers who are also in this space and struggling as well. So I want to start off, unfortunately, because I'm a little egocentric because I'm Australian, I'm going to start off with the Australian data, guys. Sorry. For those of you globally who are listening, I promise I'll get to you in a sec. But I want to start off with what's happening in Australia right now. And I think one of many studies, guys, and data collection tools has been the Australian Early Development Census, which is a large national measure of children's development as they start school in Australia. So I want to talk about the 2024 AEDC, the Australian Early Development Census. So you can find that online as well. And with this particular census, they collected data from 288,483 children in 7,368 schools via 16,723 teachers. Yes, I read my notes, you guys. For somebody who usually bounces on topics, I'm being very disciplined today, you guys. So over 94% of in-scope children in those schools participated. So we've got a pretty large, it's not significant, but it's a large cohort, right? So what they looked at was 5 domains of what they are assessing when children start school. So they're assessing physical health and well-being, social competence, emotional maturity, language and cognitive skills, communication skills, and general language. So in 2024, the proportion of children who were on track when they started school in those 5 domains dropped from 54.8% in 2021 to 52.9% in 2024. So what we're seeing in our least disadvantaged areas was around 61% of kids were on track, but in our most disadvantaged areas, about 41% were on track for starting school. So what we're seeing in terms of declines in that domain, where the biggest declines were in social competence and emotional maturity. I know for anyone listening who is a child-centered practitioner in Australia right now, I know those statistics do not surprise you. How are the children in your practice in that 4 to 6 year old age group coping with social competencies and emotional maturity? My guess is not great. Not great. So we're going to unpack some of the factors that have influenced that, but I wanted to start off this conversation with the data because that's really important that we have those facts behind us, or at least the start, guys. It's not exhaustive. A meta-analysis, let's talk about our global friends across the globe, across the 25 other countries around the world who listen to our podcast, those practitioners who are working and using play therapy in their clinics and spaces. So what we have found of a meta-analysis in more recent literature has identified elevated prevalence of anxiety symptoms and disorders in children and adolescents during the pandemic. Anxiety symptoms and disorders during COVID-19 pandemic in children and adolescents in 2023 report significant impacts globally. And I will quote the academic literature that I am referencing here today, guys. So that will be in the notes of our podcast. So globally, we are also seeing in meta-analyses an increase in anxiety. The study that I'm talking about in particular, for that global data, found that the prevalence of any anxiety symptoms was higher than pre-pandemic estimates, though numbers vary by country. So what does this mean when we look at the data in relation to what we're seeing in the playroom, or what we're seeing in those referrals and presentations of kids starting school? So kids are essentially, from what we're reading, entering school with weaker readiness for school in those social and emotional competencies. We also have an increase in global anxiety, which in essence kind of gives this sort of perfect storm when we look at that entry of children into the school setting in relation to their mental health. So this is starting to, I guess, structure our conversation around why we might be seeing some of these issues now where we haven't necessarily seen the same statistics before. So I want to reference here, I guess, in this next section, talking about in your clinics and in classrooms when we are hearing reports from parents and teachers and educators, as well as the children that we're working with in the playroom. What are we hearing? What are those presenting issues for that 4 to 6 year old age group? So the biggest one, and I would say anecdotally for me, absolutely. So for you, those of you listening or watching, I'm not sure if this resonates for you, but separation anxiety, guys, in that 4 to 6 year old age group. How many of you are working with kids who are struggling with separation anxiety, or parents are reporting, or schools are reporting? I've actually had supervisees tell me in recent months, and again, I feel like the impact of the pandemic is certainly not consistent. So different states in Australia had different experiences, different countries around the world have had different experiences. So I don't want to generalize here. But when we're talking about some of those difficulties, what we're finding is things like kids not wanting to separate at school drop-off. And I'm hearing that from my supervisees, but I've even heard stories of education settings. So schools, for example, primary schools here in Australia, having to have staff at reception to help with that transition for kids who are highly anxious separating from their parents at drop-off, and needing to help buffer that to help separate that child and transition them into the classroom setting. Like, this is something that certainly I've been working in child protection and the community services support sector for the last 20 years. That's not something I have necessarily heard consistently in my career. So there seems to be an uptick in this at the moment, and that impact is being felt across families and across schools. So difficulty with separating and dropping off, worrying something is going to happen to their parent. So struggling to be away for the whole day from school and needing to see them or needing to talk to them during the day. Refusing to stay at school, so simply just not being able to cope and needing mum or dad or carer to come and pick them up. Generalized anxiety, guys, as well. What are we seeing here? So worries around illness, what's going to happen, worrying about germs, having an unsettled routine, changes in peer relationships, and certainly across this cohort, that hypervigilance, hyperarousal state. Another big area that we're starting to see in terms of presenting issues is social and emotional delays. And again, I don't think that this is a surprise for anyone who is working in this space right now as a child-centered play therapist in your community. So what does that look like when I say social and emotional delays? Trouble making friends, trouble sharing, navigating conflict, negotiating, regulating big feelings like anger or frustration, troubles with transitions, all of the above. All of the above. So if you are seeing that for your child or for your client, you are not alone. And I know that I use that term a fair bit when I'm talking to our incredible circle community in terms of play therapists. But I think that this is a message that needs to go beyond just us to those families and our communities, to know that and validate that this is not just you. This is not in isolation, that something like this is happening right now. And I want to start that conversation and normalize that conversation around talking about some of these struggles and stresses that families are experiencing. So we can lean into the data with this. We can lean into so many studies as well, guys, but we could lean into that AEDC census data that I mentioned at the start for our Australian cohorts, where it does say that there is declines in those social competencies and emotional maturity. The data's saying that, but we're also seeing that in the presentation of kids. That school readiness, and as I mentioned earlier, attendance issues. So showing fatigue more, reluctance to come or to stay, clinginess at the school door, or clinging to their mum or dad or caregiver, like I said earlier, and struggling with that separation, needing longer times to transition into the classroom, struggling to settle. All of those things come under those presenting issues. So when we're looking at this globally, not just in Australia, but linking to that pandemic context, we acknowledge that for the kids that are 4 to 6 years old right now, when they were born and during those first couple of years of life, and I'm going to talk about the neuroscience in a sec, but if we talk about it more in a context perspective, that particular cohort when they were little had fewer preschool hours or may not have even attended kindy or daycare at all. They had less peer interactions, social interactions, and play, you guys. Fewer extracurricular activities. That wasn't a thing as much during COVID, as you guys know. And again, restrictions looked different across the globe, but certainly social distancing meant that a lot of that play-based activities wasn't as accessible during that time. There was less of a regular routine because we were kind of responding to crisis as it kind of occurred. More parent-mediated screen time, and fewer transitions. So these are just some of the factors here, guys, and I'm going to talk about now that neuroscience. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that there was a missing time period for these kids when they were 1 and 2, so 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, where they were not able to engage with their peers in their community settings. Sometimes even at parks or recreational facilities, they were restricted to their home environments often, which meant that there was not as many peer opportunities for social connection. And so though some of those rituals, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but some of those rituals that you would have as a beginning parent or for those children in that age group, I know for myself, and I'm again talking to Brisbane, and I'm talking to, I guess, when were my kids born? 2012 and 2013. So like a while ago, you guys. We would have things like, playgroups where you would meet. I remember taking my kids to the child health, the local public kind of health system clinic where they offered free playgroups. So you could go and mix with kids of a similar age. You would have activities at libraries and things run by the local council and activities in the park and all of those things that are offered to children during that time and for parents as well to help them connect and be able to, just debrief with another parent in the trenches of, that first and second and third year of life for kids. None of that was available around that time, or it looked different in many senses. So it was online a lot of the time. So kids missed out on that opportunity for skills practice, for being able to emotionally regulate, navigate conflict with their peers, be able to engage in self-help, be able to resolve conflict if it came up in terms of their relationships with others and their social connections, being able to process feelings so that they could cope with their anxiety. Not a lot of those opportunities were around during that time. And so we're starting to see some of this context linked to the data. So I want to talk about why this particular cohort of kids is a little different. What I have started to say to parents and to supervisees is that we would be doing, and again, I'm caveating this by saying this is just my conjecture, guys, and just my anecdotal experience, waving all of the flags, guys, true transparency here. But I think that it is doing somewhat of a disservice to this population to compare them to what we currently know around child development theory and those benchmarks for what children should be achieving. This is a different population, and we need to recognize and honor and validate and acknowledge that. So what do I mean by that? Why are they different? So let's look a little bit at the prenatal and infancy influences. So while the pandemic, neurobiology data is still emerging, and I said this at the beginning, this is going to be a pool of research that is going to constantly grow and evolve in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So I definitely encourage you guys to be keeping up to date with some of that research if you can, to understand what are the current implications for practice. But what we are seeing in the emerging data is that there is a growing evidence of exposure to prenatal stress or maternal anxiety during COVID relating somewhat to potentially impacts on how the child and the infant's brain grew. and how it was changed. So some of the information that we're starting to see in the literature is examples like, say, smaller amygdala volumes. So that part of the brain that's important for emotional regulation being smaller than their same age peers in, say, a different timeline, so five years prior. So we're starting to see higher negative affect and other, I guess, kind of byproducts of some of that exposure. I often share as well with parents when we are considering some of that in utero exposure to anxiety and stress and what that means for bubs when they are born, when babies are born, that sometimes they are born slightly elevated in terms of that stress and anxiety symptomology themselves. So they are more dysregulated, cry more difficult to settle, all of those things. And so I won't go into that in too much detail, but I want to emphasize here that we need to start the conversation about acknowledging that this was an incredibly stressful time for parents. I just don't want to share and talk about this topic without very empathically acknowledging that this was a really tough time for everyone. So this is definitely not a conversation around looking at causes, but we're looking at those contributing factors, and we were all doing the best we could at that point of time with the information that we had. So we are having that retrospective kind of analysis now, and we're starting to see some of the data emerge. So I just want to give so much grace and love to all of those parents who were pregnant during that time. I couldn't even imagine what that would have been like in terms of some of those restrictions. I believe or I understand for some parents there was restrictions in the hospitals in terms of who could be there and who could be present, what those medical appointments leading up to the birth look like. So many different impacts there, guys, of what they went through, parents who had a baby during that time. So what are we looking at when we're talking about the early brain development of this cohort between 0 to 3 years of age? So that 2020 to 2022 timeline for those kids born during that time. We know that the brain is highly experience dependent. That's what the research tells us. So it's dependent on that relational input, those experiences of connections and interactions with others. The brain depends on that co-regulation because when babies are born, they're born to connect with and attune with their primary caregiver for survival. It's part of their growth and development when they're little, until they have some of that independence themselves and that maturation. So they look for co-regulation from their parents. So if parents were struggling and stressed during that time, that would have been really difficult to do. So again, showing so much grace and compassion for parents during that time, because that would have been really hard. That would have been really difficult. But they're also dependent on those peer and play experiences. They matter for those development of those connections in the brain in those early years. So when that typical practice around, say, daycare, kindy, playgroup, library time, whatever that looked like, free peer play in the playground at the local park, when that's disrupted, they may miss some of those opportunities to establish those guidelines and I guess kind of pathways to help the child to be able to establish those skills. So definitely in terms of social input, if we kind of build on this a little bit more to talk about that regulation practice, kids learn self-regulation, emotional recognition, and peer interaction primarily through in-person play. That's what we know from the literature. So again, if we think of the context of that time, often that wasn't an option for some of our kids in our communities. And again, it's going to differ globally for those of you listening across the globe. But obviously then those experiences of peer negotiations, repeated separations and reunions through drop off and pick up from playgroup or daycare or whatever that looked like, that was restricted. Those experiences or opportunities to have that experience were restricted during that time. So again, we look to the data and to that census that I referenced earlier in Australia that talks about social competency and emotional maturity as showing the largest declines, which suggests those exact functions as being impacted. That's what the research and that particular census tells us. So further expanding on this about what makes this cohort different is those developmental milestone lags. This is some of the research is starting to show us those lags being present. So if you are a parent listening and you are seeing that in your particular child who meets that cohort age group, you're not alone. You're not alone. So children who were between 1 and 3 or in those first couple of years of life during the pandemic, when play dates, daycare, group care, after school, before school care, all of those things. So not so much the school care, but definitely the daycare and kindies and playgroups and preschools, where those routines were altered. They may not have had as many opportunities to practice independence, peer conflict, shared attention, and social and emotional regulation. This is what our data is showing us. So the result is, at an age of 4 to 6, they might be arriving at school needing to catch up. They are showing us through their behavior, through their emotional expression, sometimes through their verbal communication as well, and certainly in the playroom, that they are behind in terms of having some of those skills around emotional regulation, navigating peer conflicts, navigating big feelings themselves and how to express them appropriately. All of those things, they are potentially behind in. So we're seeing this lag when this cohort of 4 to 6 year olds start the school year and start the school term. So I realized in all of this conversation around schooling, I forgot to caveat in terms of Australia. So, and again, I'm talking to Queensland in Australia, because everywhere is different, right? Depending on your country and your location. So for Queensland, it's roughly 4.5-year-olds to 6-year-olds that will start the school year at that particular age. So we are seeing those 4 to 6-year-olds starting to transition into school this year and next year. So our school year starts the end of January, beginning of February here in Australia. So we are seeing that this year, and we will absolutely see more of that presentation next year, the beginning of next year. So why is the neurobiology important here? Why does it matter? So when children are repeatedly in states of hypervigilance, hyperarousal, which we know often comes connection with feelings of anxiety, which may have been triggered by or been a part of that experiences around parental stress, the lockdown unpredictability, reduced peer connections and interactions, lots of different factors. The brain stress systems, so obviously the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex, may adapt differently. So what does that mean when we say that they may adapt differently? We're talking about them being more sensitized to threat and separation and less experienced in regulation. When I read that in the research, that kind of helped me to connect the dots, I guess, a little bit in terms of how to explain it to parents, that we really are seeing a difference in that neurobiology for this population of kids that has that output of so many things, but just as an example, that increased hypervigilance, more sensitivity to threat and separation, and less experience in regulation. So the great thing though is that we know it obviously gives us an understanding, but we can obviously also look to the literature and the research on child-centered play therapy and why we can help. So it's not all lost, guys. It's certainly systemic, I think, would be a fair comment, looking at the literature and the emerging literature, and certainly, I guess, anecdotally as well, feedback from schools, educators. Our practice this year has had the opportunity to connect with a lot of kindies and across Queensland, and it's pretty consistent, that message around seeing this particular population struggle the most in recent years with that anxiety and separation anxiety. So child-centered play therapy is an incredible way to help support these kids, to help them to transition to school, to help them to cope with that first year of school, and to be able to build some of those skills that they need to be able to engage in school. Engaging in school, and then that kind of topic around how to support them in the school setting, I feel like is a whole other episode, you guys. I really just want to keep it to under an hour, this topic, because I could talk about this all day, and I won't, so I'll pull myself back in. But I do want to talk about why child-centered play therapy works and why it's so good for this particular cohort. So we know in child-centered play therapy, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, you guys, that we provide that safe space for kids where we can help them to connect, to experience co-regulation, to role model what that socially acceptable relationship looks like, as Gary Landreth would say. But let's dig a little deeper. So how can we help this particular cohort? So we can certainly support in that attachment and co-regulation space. So for many of For many of these kids, during these years, that's what I was trying to say, they had less repeated practice of separation or reunions in early years. So where kids, and I think to my kids, and those experiences of going to daycare, and they went a couple of days a week, and so I would drop them off and pick them up, and we'd have those set days, and they would go and have those play experiences and interactions with their peers, and then I'd pick them up at the end of the day. Where for this population, this cohort of 4 to 6 year olds that we're serving now in our communities, they didn't have that practice as much. So we can offer that safe therapeutic space to do that and experience that with that relationship between the child and us as therapists. What else can we do? We can offer that sense of mastery through that experiential learning experience in the playroom, as you guys know. So we know that some of those anxiety themes around separation, transitions, change, all of those big feelings can be worked through symbolic play. We can help them to do that in their most natural mode of communication, which is play. So we can help them to cathartically process and make sense of it, and help them to feel that sense of empowerment. That's our goal. That's what we do in play therapy, in child-centered play therapy. We help to build those social emotional skills. So we are directly responding to that census, that AEDC census, I got that right, where play therapy can actively support that growth. So we help through play children to practice negotiations, turn taking with us, impulse control, emotional expression, internal locus of control, all of those things that you guys know well already, having done training in child-centered play therapy. So we can meet that need, and we can help connect and support the development of that, those particular skills for that particular cohort. We provide that language and self-narrative development. So children practice that emotional literacy and emotional learning through engaging with us. We help them to negotiate roles, tell their stories, and helping them to understand their world and what they've been through. So what I found most exciting in my research so far, and genuinely there is so much more research to go, and I will continue to do that reading up, because I think it's an ongoing building body of research in this space. But one of the guidelines that I found so super interesting, so I just wanted to mention it to our Australian listeners, is the Royal Children's Hospital Melbourne's Clinical Practice Guidelines. So I came across this as part of my research and just absolutely loved it for our child-centered play therapy practitioners in the room who are listening, where in this Australian guideline for anxiety published in 2023, it acknowledged that play therapy could be considered for children 8 years and under who are less likely, or especially for those that are less likely to engage in CBT or talk-based therapies. That's really exciting. We're seeing some of that clinical guidelines and research coming out saying, and recommendations for practice, saying that play therapy is a great tool to access support for kids struggling with anxiety. So I will definitely put the link in our notes so that you guys can access it yourselves. It's really exciting to see that mentioned in Australia. So we know, and I'm going to talk about it a bit more later, but we know globally, because I know we've got our global community as well, the meta-analyses globally of CCPT in school settings shows moderate improvements in behavioural and emotional outcomes. So using evidence-based child therapy meta-analytic summaries. So it's really important that we look to the research and talk about what are those meta-analyses saying around the application of CCPT to children. And we know, for those of you who've been studying this space for some time now, know that the favorability of having play therapy in school settings to work alongside education staff to support kids engaging in school has a great research base. So I encourage you guys to look that up, child-centered play therapy and how it helps children engage in school settings. So we know that for 4 to 6 year olds, they can't sit through long talk-based therapy sessions. So we know CCPT offers so many benefits, and I've talked about some of them already, but it definitely gives that experiential learning experience through movement, tactile play, narratives via toys, and it absolutely is developmentally appropriate. So we know that it ticks some great boxes there. It also is important for us as part of our CCPT practice to be collaborating with parents and caregivers. We do that anyway. We do our parent-carer consultation updates, as we've talked about in a previous episode. So it can be another opportunity for us to not only serve the children that are struggling in the transition to school, but also that family unit. So we know also too that there is that opportunity around child-parent relationship therapy or filial therapy as well for parents. So we can really work to upskill them with some of those play therapy skills to support their kids at home. We also know that we can definitely, as child-centered play therapists, we want to connect holistically. So that opportunity for us to connect with school staff, to do in-school observations where possible and approved, to be able to offer psychoeducation and training to educators and education staff. There is lots of different ways that we can help support families using our child-centered play therapy modality. So I know that when I have been talking to supervisees who are working with families in this space, oftentimes the questions are around how can I help support the parents? What can I give them in terms of those practical strategies for parents to be able to navigate this right now? I think what has become part of my practice over the last 12 months truly has been going back to basics. And that sounds really basic, right? But genuinely, when we look at this cohort and when we look at our current families in our communities that we're serving right now, they are so busy. It's usually 2-parent households where they're both working, most likely either part-time or full-time. They're trying to navigate extracurricular activities, going to school, events and things on the weekends, school holidays, and just day-to-day life. So I know as a parent of a 12 and a 13-year-old, I do not have a lot of time. So I think that it's really important that we acknowledge that for the parents that we are connecting with, that the first stop in that intervention is asking the parents, how are you doing? How are you going truly? And really working in those parent consult updates to build that connection and relationship between therapist and parent carer so that we can start that conversation around them being able to cope themselves. So whether that looks like their own personal therapy, whether that looks like other adjustments in the family dynamic or the family home, all of those things are unpacked in time, right? But I think at the very least, incredible empathy and compassion and validation to our parents in the trenches right now, because this is really tough. This is really hard for a lot of our families. And so just letting parents know, just as Gary Landreth would say, I hear you, I see you, I understand, and I care. We need to be doing that with parents as well. We need to pare back, go back to basics, and just give them homework like what we talk about in filial therapy or child-parent relationship therapy, about that 30-second burst of attention. Just pop your phone down, turn everything off, and just spend 30 seconds of undivided time with your child. Going back to basics to help them to be able to help regulate themselves and their child, to be able to build that attachment and connection, and just starting really slow and simple. So I think that that's really important. I have also leaned into really, as we always would do anyway, but I feel like for this population even more so, starting with some of the basics of the skills of CCPT, of reflecting feelings. Like, we're talking about emotional regulation as being part of that missed step for some of these kids in relation to those interactions and experiences in those formative years. So how can we help do that now? We equip parents with the same skills that we use in the playroom. Not exactly the same though, guys. They're not going to be play therapists, but just some of that language that they can use to help validate their child and their child's feelings. Because I think oftentimes as therapists ourselves, we assume that that's something that parents already know. My take, for what it's worth, is a lot of parents don't. And that's okay. That's okay. That's what we're here for, to help support them. So really kind of going back to basics around that. Playtime. Again, it sounds simple, but I think truly troubleshooting with our parents to say, okay, let's have some time where you just play with your child. What does that look like? Is that on a Friday afternoon after everyone's kind of finished their work week and their schooling and their homework, and you've got a window of time before you cook dinner? Like, we understand that the schedules are so hectic for a lot of our families. So practically looking at, can we make this achievable and how? To help them to build that connection and to help kids to play out. So certainly we would lean into child-parent relationship therapy if we wanted to equip them with being able to do truly CCPT practice. But I think at the basic level, just getting parents to play with their kids and not interrupt and not direct, just play with, just be with their kids for 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. Like, that will have such an incredibly huge impact on our kids if we can start to plant the seed for parents around that. But to do that, parents need to be able to be regulated and coping well themselves. So you see how I started the conversation here about what we suggest to parents around how are they doing first. We need to check in with them. How are they going? What steps do they need to put in place? What self-care do they need themselves before then we start talking about that time with their kids, but also being really mindful of that connection time. I think definitely talking about routines, and there's so many different ways we can talk about that, so I'm not going to go through too much information right now. I don't want to overload everyone, but I think having consistent bedtimes, wake-up times, predictable morning routines to help kind of support that felt experience of predictability and consistency and routine is very helpful, guys. Very, very helpful to suggest to parents. Having a gradual separation plan, so having a bit of a ritual around that separation at home, a consistent goodbye ritual, kind of building that process for kids to be able to tolerate separation and building their internal safety. And that doesn't happen overnight either. So workshopping ideas with parents around how that could look and what they could implement to be able to navigate that separation gradually to support the child. And definitely, I think helping to support that teacher-family partnership and helping to engage in that communication between family and teachers and working with them to understand the needs of your particular child or your particular client, co-create that transition plan, what that could look like in terms of mini routines at the start of the day, check-ins, a safe space or a safe activity for the child to engage in when they first come to their classroom at the start of the day, to help really sort of build that structure of that consistency and predictability. So these are definitely not heavy clinical interventions, guys, but they are evidence-informed, practical strategies that parents can use now. And we know with the right therapeutic support, we can shift this trajectory. So while the data obviously shows us this rising vulnerability for this particular cohort around that anxiety risk for kids starting school right now, we know child-centered play therapy works and play-based interventions works, and having that connection and building that system of support between the family, the child, and the school, and us as play therapists. So I really hope that this episode has connected with you as I started the conversation saying, I really genuinely want to validate for anyone in the trenches of this, whether you're a play therapist, child centered play therapist, or a parent or caregiver yourself, or working in the education space. This is a tough time, and I really want to encourage you guys to seek that support. Child-centered play therapy is a great way to do that, thanks to those clinical guidelines we have from the Royal Children's Hospital. I'm so grateful for that. So the 2023 Evidence-Based Clinical Practice Guideline for Anxiety in Children and Young People is absolutely must read, and we will provide the link in our episode notes at the end of this episode. But I think I just want to end this by saying that I am so grateful for the opportunity to be able to have this and start this conversation with all of you. I hope that it has added to your toolkit of your understanding of just what's kind of happening in our communities right now, and it starts the conversation. So please check us out on the socials. Oh my God, I'm a millennial. I say the socials. I swear I'm trying not to do that, but I still do it. So check us out on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. We are on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We would love to hear from you. So please leave comments. Tell us how you found this episode. Is there other topics that you would like me to cover in this space? Would you like a longer episode next time where we unpack this more with more of the research and data? I just wanted to start this conversation to get it going. And as I said in the title here, it's titled The Pandemic Ripple Effect. And I really hope that this conversation offers that ripple effect of wondering, self-reflection, understanding as a child-centered play therapist around how can we support this population. And we know that play is the way for these kids. So thank you so much for listening. So I will be back next week with more child-centered play therapy content as always. Please, even more so after this topic today, talking about how tough our communities and our families are doing it right now in terms of our current space. Please also look after yourselves. Be kind to you and to each other. Look after yourselves and have a great weekend. And I will talk to you again very soon. So thanks so much for listening. Bye. Thank you so much for being here for another episode of the Play Therapy Circle. If anything resonated with you today, I'd love it if you could follow the podcast, share it with a colleague, or leave a short review. It really helps others find our circle. And if you have a topic or question you'd love me to explore, I'd love to hear from you. This space is for you, and I want it to feel like a conversation. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, you belong here.